Hello, it's Del Michelle and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing a really fun sort of Valentine's inspired tarot tag along with my friends Marlena Teresa, Lisa Pepez, and Danny Mystic called Deck Crushes. So today we're going to be talking about 8 decks that we totally have a thing for. So if you haven't checked out everybody else's video, they will be linked in the description box below, along with the prompts for this tag if you'd like to join in, and of course my selections for each of the prompts. So let's go ahead and jump in. So I had such a difficult time with this tag, like actually choosing decks, only because I had so many that could fit into each category. So I've decided to approach it as like the decks that I currently have a thing for. If I did this tag again in like 6 months, I would probably choose totally different decks. And if I looked at my collection on the whole, I would probably choose different decks. But that was super overwhelming. So like, I'm just starting with what I'm currently having a thing for. So the first prompt is the Fling, the deck you had a short period of wild times. So for me, this is the Desert Illumination Tarot because this is the deck that I am currently having a fling with. I think that this deck is like super fun. The backs are cute. I really love the artwork in this deck. It is so fun. There's aliens in the Pentacle suit. Also in some of the major arcana cards, like the alien on the cow. I mean, this is such a good mood deck for me that I'm totally having a ton of fun just playing with it, getting to know it, and yeah, just incorporating it into my sort of everyday life. It's a deck that I've used quite a bit lately in terms of just everyday kind of readings. It's also a great one for when I just want to kind of have a little play with my deck, or I've also found when I need to kind of like get out of my own head, because it's really difficult for me to take myself super seriously with this deck. And when I get too far bogged down in that kind of really swordsy kind of energy, like I just need to get out of it. I just need to get out of my own way. And this deck has been working fantastic for helping me to do that. It works as a great transition deck for me too. But also it's the deck that I'm just currently having a total fling with. I don't know if it'll be like a long-term love affair kind of a thing because this is a new deck in my collection. So right now we're just hanging out, we're having a good time together, and we'll see where it takes us. But it's definitely one that is like, right now I'm using all the time. So it's definitely kind of consumed my everyday sort of practice and my everyday sort of readings. Of course, I am still doing all my normal reading stuff that I do in my monthly medicine and whatnot. But like when I just want to take a break and I just want to have like a little play, which happens every single day. At some point in every single day, I'm just like, I just need to have a little fun, like 5 minutes of fun. That's fine. And I can go back to like being all serious and productive and stuff. So this is the deck that I've been pulling out for that, for the last couple of weeks, and it's been really fun, and I've really been enjoying getting to know it and working with it in that way. So this is my Fling deck, the Desert Illuminations Tarot. So the next prompt is Puppy Love, and this is a deck in which you were infatuated but couldn't really make a long-term commitment. Now, there are probably other decks that I could choose that I've worked with more recently, but the deck that really came to mind for that kind of idea for me was the True Heart Intuitive Tarot. I have trimmed my copy, so it does look a little bit different. I've trimmed it and edged it, and this is a deck for me that like I really liked it when I first got it. I was a little bit infatuated with it when I first got it. I really enjoyed the guidebook, and then I haven't touched it really since. I think I've done a few minor readings here and there with it, but it's been one that kind of just got shoved on the shelf, and I almost wonder if our time has kind of passed. Like it was just a puppy love sort of thing, right? It's very much a Rider-Waite-Smith deck, and it is a wonderful Rider-Waite-Smith deck. I love the depictions. I love the diversity. I love the fun, vibrant energy in it. It does feel very young to me, and perhaps that might be something to do with it there. It also has some really wonderful kind of Pip style, almost thothy influence. But for whatever reason, like I just don't pull it out to work with it very often. Although now that I'm looking through it again, I'm like, why don't I read with this deck? And it's probably just because there are so many other things in my collection that also have that kind of RWS thothy sort of blend to it. And there are just other decks that I personally prefer, that the aesthetic is more in my wheelhouse. And this deck, while it is a fantastic reader, does feel very young, kind of modern, and like a little bit outside of where I am now in my life. It feels like a deck that I would have really, really appreciated in my 20s, and I just don't quite connect with it on a deep and personal level the way that I really do like to connect with my decks. They're not all deep personal readers. I do have puppy love decks. I do have fling decks. But when a deck stays in my collection long term, it's usually because it's like we have a pretty deep connection. And that's just not happening with this deck, and that's okay. But I did really, really enjoy my time with it, and I did really enjoy getting to know it. It was definitely a puppy love kind of scenario because there are some cards in this deck that I'm just like still absolutely in love with. But overall, I think it was just a puppy love deck. I enjoyed it. I got to know it, and now it's probably time for it to move on. In all honesty, this deck has gone back and forth from my purgatory box. Sometimes it gets in there, sometimes it comes out, but it just really isn't one that I ever feel super called to work with anymore. So maybe it was just kind of a puppy love thing, but it is a wonderful little Rider-Waite Smith, almost thothy kind of a blended deck. The little guidebook is great, and it's often a deck I recommend for beginners. So that is the True Heart Intuitive Tarot, my puppy love deck. So the next prompt is the Friends with Benefits, a deck you care about but sometimes get extremely passionate for. And I feel like these days, like, my videos just wouldn't be complete if I wasn't showing my Villains Tarot. This is kind of like, I don't want to say it's taken the place of the Llewellyn, but because it hasn't, like, by any stretch of the imagination. Those decks exist in completely different spaces for me. But this deck, I mean, has taken the place of the Llewellyn, as in it keeps showing up again and again on my channel. I have edged mine in purple, and this deck, y'all know how much I love this deck, right? Like, it started off as a fling, and that was one of the reasons why I decided to choose this one for this particular prompt, because it started off as a fling. And like then it kind of became this puppy love thing where I was like, oh, I really, really do like this deck. And now it's turned into a Friends with Benefits kind of a thing, as in like, I can count on this deck for any type of a reading. It's so freaking versatile in my collection. It's also very much a good mood deck. It calls me out on my crap. I use it in my Blessing and a Curse reading. And like, it's just been a really wonderful, surprising, and yet also meaningful deck for me, which is just completely a surprise. It took me off guard. And I think that's kind of a Friends with Benefit kind of energy, right? Like, we get along, we really enjoy each other's company, we hang out together a lot, and on occasion, like, we get a little intimate, and I think that is just so cool about this deck. It's also a deck that I get extremely passionate for because I show it all the time. I talk about it all the time. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea. It is a little bit on the pippy side. I do not mind a pippy deck as long as like I know that's what I'm getting into. But I do feel that these are pips done really, really well. I love the characters. I mean, Gaston for the Knight of Cups, yes, please. Like, there's so much about this deck that I absolutely love, but it is more in that kind of Friends with Benefits kind of zone for me because, like, it's also very much a deck that I can just turn to for, like, whatever. Anytime I need advice, it doesn't matter what kind of advice I need, it will give it to me. It will give it to me straight. It will give it to me with love, but it doesn't shy away from like telling me the things that I need to hear, right? Like a good friend would. They'll love you, they'll support you, but they'll tell you the truth and they'll tell you what you need to hear. And then occasionally, like, we get super deep, and I think that that's just super cool. And I absolutely love this deck. I know y'all are probably sick and tired of hearing me talk about it, but that is my Friends with Benefits deck, the Disney Villains Tarot. So the next prompt is the Love at First Sight, and this is a deck that you loved right from the get-go. And for me, my recent Love at First Sight, because let's be honest, like, I have a lot of Love at First Sight decks, but my most recent one is Tarot of the Cat People. And this little deck has completely taken me by surprise. It does like almost look like it is out of print on the Amazon website, but it is still available from the publisher from US Games. So this little deck, oh my goodness, like, I've seen this deck around countless times, and I've always been like, it's really cool, but it's like super weird and I don't know if it's for me. And I was also like, I'm not like really a cat person, right? more of a dog person, and it's not that I'm not a cat person, it's just I'm highly allergic to cats, so like that kind of gives me pause, right? However, I do like love big cats, and like both my moon and rising sign are Leo, so I definitely feel like a draw to big cat energy. So anyway, long story short, I finally got this deck in, and like ever since I took it out of the box, I was like in love with these weird cat people. They like speak to me in a language that I just totally get, and it just speaks so clear, so profoundly. And the moment I saw it, it was just like, I was in love. I love this deck. I love the colors. I love the weird artwork. I love the quirky energy of it. I love that it gives me messages that just resonate on such a deep and profound level, but also like are very direct and to the point. And I know exactly what this deck is trying to tell me whenever I work with it. It's very blunt, but it's also very much like speaking my language in terms of like, it's a little bit odd, right? It's a little bit into that kind of sort of sci-fi kind of realm. Like this is a whole nother world to me, and that totally vibes with like me and my life, and I love it. And yeah, so this was definitely my current love at first sight deck. Like ever since I took it out of the box, I have been in love with this deck. So that is my love at first sight deck, my current love at first sight deck, the Tarot of the Cat People. So the next deck is the One Night Stand, a deck you tried out but moved on from almost immediately. However, sometimes you still think about that deck. And for me, it's the Ask the Witch Tarot, which I did a whole freaking ranty video about on how much I detest this cardstock, how difficult this deck is for me to actually work with, and yet I still have it. I don't really care for the backs. I don't think they really fit the deck. And like as much as I had that sort of off-putting experience with the deck, I used it just a handful of times and I was like, I just can't. It's so big, bulky, heavy, sticky, like tactilely it doesn't work for me. Like I made a whole video. We won't go into that here. However, I still have this deck, and I still have this deck because I still think about this artwork. Like the artwork is fantastic, and I really want to try to work with it, but the whole experience and then having made a video and having gone through all of that, like I kind of like tainted it for myself in a way. And so it's hanging out in my purgatory box, but I don't know that it will ever officially go away because I do still think about it. And even though like it didn't really work for me in terms of like trying to actually use this deck, there's so much about this deck that I really love in terms of the artwork and what's been done with the tarot system, the structure, like how it's been depicted is really fantastic. And there's something about this artwork that just, I don't know, it really, really gets me. And I'm super sad that the cardstock is so freaking unusable for me. But that doesn't mean that I might not try to do something with this deck at some point to try and make it more usable. I can't really make it any thinner, but maybe I could trim it, make it smaller. And anyway, but point being, this is a deck that I got, I worked with once or twice, and I put it right back in its box and was like, yeah, no, I can't work with this deck. It is too ridiculously big and chunky, and it was totally a one-night stand, but I do still think about it, and I still think about the artwork, and I do still own it. So there's that. So that's my one-night stand, the Ask the Witch Tarot. So the next prompt is actually one of my favorites. It's the We Were on a Break prompt, a deck you were separated from for any reason. And for me, I chose the Nicoletta Ceccoli Tarot because this is a deck that I love and adore, but I quite often have to take breaks from because like it's a powerful deck, and it is a deck that I use for very specific kind of work that tends to be very intense, very deep, and very personal. But on the flip side of that, I do also just really love this artwork. It just speaks to me on such a deep and profound level. but like I have to take breaks from it because like sometimes it just gets to be a little too suffocating, a little too much, and like we just need to take a step back from each other. And so this is a deck that I will never ever get rid of. I have multiple copies of this deck. I have this one, I have my trimmed and modified version, and I also have the small pocket version. Like that's how much I love it. I have many, many copies of it, but it's definitely a deck that I have to take a break from now and then because like it just gets to be a lot. And we're on a break and I will work with other things and like we'll come back together and then we'll do some work and then we'll take a break, and it's like totally a Ross and Rachel thing, right? Will they or won't they? I mean, we all know in the end they will. And that's very much how I feel about this deck. Like we're always going to be together. Like this deck is like my lobster, right? It's one of my many lobsters, but it's not a deck that I can work with all the time because it definitely has a very specific energy, a very specific place in my practice, and I use it for very specific work that I'm not always in the mindset to do and to engage with. And so yeah, we often take breaks, but we always come back together, and it's always going to be a part of my life. I can never imagine getting rid of the Nicoletta Ceccoli, and like in fact because like I have multiple, so it's always going to be around, be here. So this is my We Were on a Break deck, the Nicoletta Ceccoli Tarot. So the next prompt is marriage material. So this is a deck that has proven its value to you over time. I added the over time. And for me, that is the Jonasa Jaus, which I believe is how you pronounce it, tarot. And this is one of the few decks that goes in a box, in a bag. I believe this is the second edition, perhaps third. Here's the beautiful backs. I would love to have multiple copies of this deck as well, but this is an indie deck and it's not always in print, and sometimes it can be fairly spendy. But this deck over the years has like proven itself as just this little perfect companion for me in terms of tarot. It's very pippy, it's very numerological and elemental. I absolutely love the depiction. I love the art style. I love the energy. It has everything in a deck that I would want to see in a deck. I also think the shape is really cool. Like because it's long, it can be a little tricky for me to get my hands around, but I can still riffle and bridge it and all of that good stuff. So that's really cool. And like it's kind of unique in that it's super long and skinny. The only other deck I have that has this kind of a layout to it is the name just totally escaped me. The little kind of vintagey looking one that a lot of us have. Y'all probably know which one I'm talking about. Anyway, this deck is amazing, right? And it's so funny because like the talking about young characters, right? Let me just call myself out on something here. This also has very young characters. Also, like side note, this is my favorite emperor ever in any deck, ever, ever, ever. Perfect emperor in my opinion. Anyway, this deck is full of very young characters, and like that, as I mentioned, like in the True Heart tarot, right? That doesn't always work for me, but this is proof that sometimes it does. And I think for me, because it's not actually about the characters, I look past the characters when I work with this deck, and I'm looking at more the numerological and the elemental undercurrent that is in this deck. And because that is the way that I do primarily read, that's like my base foundation for working with tarot. And I can layer over the top of that. I can layer Thoth, I can layer RWS, I can layer astrology, or, you know, whatever else, color, shape, all that kind of good stuff, right? I can layer as much as I want on top of it. But really, at the underneath of that is that numerological and elemental energy that creates the foundation of how I read. And this deck just so succinctly captures that for me. This just gets down to the basics, down to the energetic root of the tarot for me. I love and appreciate it for that. And so even though the characters are very, very young, I don't really look at the characters. It's not about them for me. It is about the energetic underlay, the numerological and elemental associations that I find in the deck, in the card. And so I think that's why this is one of those cases where even though like I'm constantly saying, you know, there's only young people in the deck, right? This is one of those cases where it works for me because for me, the people aren't the focus of the deck. Whereas in something like the True Heart Intuitive Tarot, the people are very much the focus of the card. And again, that's a very me thing, but As far as marriage material goes, yeah, the Jonasa Jaus is definitely a proven reader in my collection, and it's definitely one that I would intend to spend the rest of my life with. So the final prompt in our deck crush tag is the happily ever after, and this is your true love in a deck. Now, there's lots of decks I could have chosen, right? Like the Llewellyn, the Green Witch, even something like the Northern Animal Tarot decks that I really love and plan to keep forever and ever. But I decided to choose instead my original true love happily ever after deck, and that is the Steampunk Tarot. This is a deck that I've had for, I don't know, two decades maybe. I've had this deck for a really long time. This was the second deck, I do believe, that I ever purchased, and it's one that's been in my collection ever since. And it is probably, out of all the decks that I own, out of all the years that I've owned tarot decks, this is probably the deck that I've read with the most, because it was the only deck that I read with for many, many years. And it's because this steampunky world, it was just so my vibe, my jam when I was, at that point in my life. I do still really love the whole steampunk sort of energy. It's got that beautiful blend of that kind of historical energy, very Victorian, right? I know I say Victorian, it doesn't even matter what time period it actually is. It's always Victorian to me because that's how little I know about that kind of stuff. But it feels Victorian, but it's also sci-fi, and that's totally my jam. Totally my jam. So this to me is my original true love deck, because it was the first deck that I ever actually really loved and worked with in a very dedicated way. It was the only deck I had that I read with for many, many years. The first deck I ever owned was the Legacy of the Divine, but once I got this one, I really didn't read with the Legacy of the Divine anymore, because it wasn't me. It didn't fit. It didn't resonate. And this resonated from the moment I got it, and it's been a tried and true reader in my collection for years and years. Again, it's my original true love deck. This is the first time that I really realized that a deck could speak to me on a personal level, and that it could be more than just a tarot deck, right? The Legacy of the Divine to me was always just a tarot deck. It was a deck I used to do readings with. I didn't really have any sort of a personal connection with it. This is the first deck that I ever created a personal connection with. And it's still, Death card's upside down, it's still one of my absolute favorites. So yeah, fantastic deck. I absolutely love this deck. So yeah, this is my really, really bowed, really beat up, my original happily ever after deck, the Steampunk Tarot. So there we go. That is a look at my current deck crushes, some of my deck loves for many, many, many years. If you haven't yet, definitely go check out the videos by Marlena, Lisa, and Danny. I'll leave all of them linked in the description box below for you. You'll also find all of the prompts in case you'd like to do your own VR, or just share with me in the comments below which decks you would choose from your collection for each of these prompts, or even just which deck you're currently having a little deck crush on. As always, you'll find links for everything I've shown here in the description box of this video. Thank you so much for hanging out with me, and thank you to my friends Marlena, Lisa, and Danny for playing along with this deck crush tag. I hope to see many more videos because it's just good fun. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I look forward to sharing with you again soon.